Hi everybody, welcome back to the lecture on parasites and zoonoses. And we're going to pick up with a case study. It's a case study of Lyme disease. It's something that maybe a lot of you might be familiar with. The disease, Lyme disease, is caused by a bacterium. The bacterium is called Borrelia burgdorferi. And here's a picture of what they look like. It's a spirochete bacterium, so it's one of those corkscrew-shaped things. And back to our lecture outline. So the way it gets into the human body is through an arachnid vector. So the vector is a critter that carries the disease, the bacterium, in its bloodstream, but it gets it from something else. And it gets it usually from a small mammal. We'll talk about that in a minute. It's carrying the disease between the host mammal species and taking it to humans. And if you look at a picture of the deer tick, it's easy to see why it's so effective in spreading the disease. These things are really, really tiny. As all arachnids do, it goes through a series of life stages. So when it first hatches out of an egg, it's a larva, and it's really teeny tiny. Its first molt brings it to the life stage of being a nymph. Still very, very tiny. Here's a dime for comparison. You can see how small it is. At this point, it could bite you and transmit the disease to you, or it could do it as an adult. The adults are just a little bit bigger than the nymph, so this is the male here, and the female here. Female is a little bit bigger than the male because she's the one who has to lay the eggs. Teeny tiny little critter, very easily missed. So if you, by chance, get bitten by one of these ticks and you come down with Lyme disease, the first symptom is usually a bullseye rash. About 90% of the time that people get Lyme disease, they get this bullseye rash first. So it's very characteristic, has a reddened area of skin, and then a lighter area of skin, and then a reddened area of skin. So it has this concentric circle pattern, pretty obvious. If it was on some part of your body that you see all the time, you would notice it right away and you'd probably go right to the doctor. But the trick with these ticks is that very often they head for places where you can't see them. So they're very often found in your hair, and you might not even notice that the tick was there. You wouldn't notice the bullseye rash. So a lot of people have the bullseye rash but never notice it. And then another fraction of people get bitten, get the disease, but never have the bullseye rash. The next symptoms are pretty ambiguous, right? Low-grade fever, muscle aches, lethargy. There's a huge number of illnesses that all have these very same symptoms. So if you got sick like this, you would probably think it was the flu or something, and it would be over in a couple days. You probably wouldn't think, first off, that it's Lyme disease. And so very often when humans come down with this, it's not treated right away. If it were treated right away, you take a course of antibiotics and it's over with pretty quickly. But if you don't treat it right away, then the problems become much more severe and often permanent. And these can include problems with the heart, arthritis, and neurological symptoms, so problems with your brain. Let's take a look at the life cycle of the deer tick, because really the life cycle of the deer tick is the key to preventing infection with Lyme disease. So the life cycle is very complex. When the eggs are laid, they're not infected. So you have the eggs hatching into larvae which don't have Lyme disease. And the first thing they do, they're going to hatch in the spring, and the larvae will try to find some sort of blood meal in the summertime, and its meal is going to be something little, either a small mammal or a bird, something warm-blooded, so mouse or bird here. And that blood meal gives it the energy it needs to molt to the next stage. So it's going to, after its blood meal, it's going to drop off, it's going to be in the ground someplace on the ground, and it's going to molt and become a nymph. So it's a little bit bigger, and it's going to go through the fall and the winter, not much going on. It's going to go dormant. It won't be feeding. But the next year, it's going to need another blood meal in order to metamorphose into an adult. So it's going to feed sometime spring, late spring, early summer, and it very often will go to a larger kind of host at this point. So it could be a person, could be a mouse, could be a dog, could be a deer. It's getting another blood meal, then dropping off, then metamorphosing into an adult. And then the adult female anyway, takes one more meal, usually from a largish host, so a person, a deer, or a dog, either in the fall or in the early spring in preparation for laying eggs. So here's where the eggs are laid, the adults die, and then when the eggs hatch, they are larvae again, and they go through the same 2-year life cycle. So at the time of hatching, the larva is not infected. It's going to get infected, perhaps, when it has this first blood meal. And if it doesn't get infected at this point, it may get infected during the second blood meal in its second year. If a larva is infected and its next meal is a person, then that person has a high probability of contracting Lyme disease. If the nymph gets infected at the second stage by feeding on a mouse or some other organism, but likely a mouse that has the Lyme disease bacterium in its bloodstream, then the next time around, that third meal, if it attaches to a human, it could transmit the disease to the human then. So there's a couple of different stages where the tick can pick up the Lyme disease bacteria, and a couple of stages where it can pass that disease on to humans. Alrighty, so this just walks you through the same steps that I just showed you on the diagram. The eggs are laid on the ground. They're not infected at the time that they're laid. So when they hatch into larvae, they are free of the disease. And again, this shows you in comparison to a coin, the size of the organism that we're talking about. So the larva is very, very tiny. And they feed on small mammals, so small birds, small mice. One of those small mammals is the primary host for the Borrelia bacterium. That's the white-footed mouse, and this mouse is super, super common. It's found all over the place along the East Coast, and it has a very high probability of having that Lyme disease bacterium in its bloodstream. So if that larva attaches to one of these mice and takes a blood meal, it has a very high probability of also contracting that bacterium. So after they get that first blood meal, they're going to metamorphose into the next life stage, the nymph, which is a little bit bigger. And if they've fed on the white-footed mouse, they will be carrying around that bacterium. And so the next time they need to get a blood meal, they will pass along that bacterium to some other host that they're feeding off of. It takes about 24 hours or so for the bacterium to work its way into the bloodstream of the new host. So what happens is when the tick bites, its saliva is partly going into the bloodstream as it's drinking the blood of the host organism. And that saliva doesn't carry the bacterium all the time. The bacterium actually has to move from other parts of the tick's body into the salivary glands, and that migration takes a few hours. So typically if you find the tick on you right away and you pull it off, you're very, very unlikely to have gotten Lyme disease. But if the tick is there undisturbed for a long period of time, 24 hours or so, then there's a good chance that if it is infected, the person that has been bitten has been infected too. After that blood meal, the nymphs drop off again onto the ground and they metamorphose into the adult stage. They're going to take one more blood meal before laying eggs. And at this point, they're usually feeding off of a deer and not a human. So the most common time for humans to get infected is in this nymph blood feeding stage. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is that the nymphs are much smaller than the adults. The adults, even though they're pretty small, they're large enough that you might notice them if they were crawling around on you. And so people are more likely to notice the adults and pull them off before they've had a chance to pass along the bacterium. On the other hand, the nymphs are much smaller and much more likely to go unnoticed. And the second reason that that humans are more likely to get infected by the nymphs is because of the timing of the meals. So the nymphs take their blood meal in the spring and summer, and this is a time when humans are very likely to be in environments that are infested with ticks. So they're going to come into contact, it's much more likely. The adults, on the other hand, are taking their blood meals much later in the season, so that toward the end of fall or towards the end of winter, very beginning of spring. And this is a time of year where humans are much less likely to be in the environment where the ticks are. So for this reason, for those two reasons, the size difference and the timing of the blood meals, it's usually the nymphs that are spreading the disease to humans. So there's a couple of really cool things that have come out of some work done by mammalogists. And this is looking at the ties between, or the influence of ecology on the incidence of Lyme disease. And you guys probably know that the incidence of Lyme disease has been going up. And we're very interested in figuring out why this is, because if they can go up, maybe we can do something about it to bring those disease rates back down, because it's a really tricky disease to diagnose and to treat. So the two ecological factors that we know now affect the incidence of Lyme disease are acorn production and small mammal biodiversity. The acorn production is pretty straightforward. The deer mice eat acorns. And so when there are lots of acorns, the deer mice eat a lot and they have lots of babies, and the babies all survive. And then the next year there's tons and tons of deer mice, and they're all infected with Lyme disease. And so they can be hosts for the arachnids, and down the line humans will get bit more often. The small mammal biodiversity situation is a little bit more complex but really interesting. And the idea is this: when the larvae hatch, they're looking for something to feed off of. They're not looking for white-footed mice. They're just looking for anything they can grab a blood meal from. And if biodiversity is high, if there are lots of other little mammals around and lots of birds around, then the likelihood is they're going to choose something to feed off of that doesn't have the Borrelia bacterium in its bloodstream. It's only the white-footed mouse that really is a great host and has lots and lots of the bacteria in its bloodstream. The others can get infected, but they don't carry very many copies of the bacterium. The bacterium doesn't grow well in their bloodstream. So if a tick bites anything else, it's unlikely to get the bacterium. If it bites a white-footed mouse, it's really likely to get the bacterium in it and transfer it. So the more choices it has, the less likely it's going to get infected, and the less likely it'll infect a human. So for that reason, preserving biodiversity is really important to keeping the rates of Lyme disease low. And the trick is, when humans come into an environment and they start tearing down forests and they start putting up houses, that disrupts the ecosystem and biodiversity goes down. Lots of species can't live in that kind of environment, and so they either fail to reproduce or they go someplace else. The two critters that do really well in that environment are white-footed mice and white-tailed deer. And so these are species that harbor the Lyme disease bacterium, and so by going into places and changing the landscape, humans are actually increasing the likelihood that they will get Lyme disease. So kind of an interesting contribution of mammalogists to our understanding of Lyme disease. The very last thing I want to do is give you a quick introduction to toxoplasmosis. The other things that I've given you to watch and to read have to do with toxoplasmosis. One is an interview with someone who has studied this, and then there's a Popular Science article that also gives you some background. And I wanted to show you a little bit about the life cycle of this critter. So basically, it's a parasite of cats. It also infects mice, so the cats, in the cat feces, they have eggs basically that are eaten by the mice. The mice kind of go nutty and behave in a way that makes them more likely to be eaten by cats. And the problem comes when those eggs are consumed by humans either from raw meat or from kitty litter.